Today, we are excited to have our guest, Dr. Toby Matthiesen, who is a senior lecturer in global Islam at the University of Bristol and has previously held fellowships at the universities of Oxford, Venice, Stanford, Cambridge, and the LSE. The Caliph and the Imam, The Making of Sunnism and Shi'ism, is published by Oxford University Press in 2023. This book, I can certainly describe, is no less than a textbook almost on Sunni-Shi'i relations. As someone who has been in Shi'i studies for a long time and Islamic studies in general, I may describe it as a textbook or almost like a handbook, a must read in many ways. Toby, in looking at the sheer breadth of this book, its length, the number of notes, this looks like an extensive amount of work that you've put into this. This must have taken years, perhaps. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey into writing this book and just the sheer breadth of it and depth?
Well, thank you first very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast and to talk about this book with you. You're right that it did take me quite a few years to write, but it's also, in a sense, a product of a even longer engagement with the topic. So during my undergrad and postgrad, I, broadly speaking, became interested in this subject, and my PhD ended up being about the Shi'i community in Saudi Arabia and their relationship with the state. And so, I guess in some ways, Sunni-Shi'i relations in a specific context, but also more widely in the Gulf, and Iran, the Iranian Revolution, and Arab Shi'i communities more generally. So, but this particular book I started sort of, when the Arab uprisings started to sort of unravel in a really bad way, and there was so much negativity and a lot of sectarian violence, and there were many questions, also in the public and amongst scholars, about why this was all occurring. So, in a sense, what I try to do here is really bring together sort of everything, I guess, we know, or that has been sort of broadly speaking written on the subject, and try to synthesize scholarship from different periods and places, but also different academic fields. So I specifically started working on this in 2015 and 16, and have been sort of writing and researching this ever since. And I did quite a lot of additional field work just for this book, which then eventually, I guess, was cut short, or, there was a sort of, the COVID pandemic had a sort of silver lining in the sense that it forced all of us to sort of, sit at home and actually finish some of the projects that we've been working on. So this book became sort of my project throughout the pandemic, in a sense, no more extra research, no more field work, and actually just getting the writing done, because, otherwise maybe this would have perhaps never been finished, because it is, as you say, quite a sort of a big topic. And even at this stage, it's quite substantial, both in text and in notes. So I'm also quite glad that I managed to sort of finish it now.
Wonderful. Again, I mean, it just has such a, I will definitely use it in the classroom as an instructor and as a teacher. I think it would be both appropriate for undergraduates and even graduate students, both as an introduction and even as a research text, because there's just so much in it that if you want to think about the Ottomans, you want to think about the Bumayyads, you want to look at different historical periods, you can refer to different chapters in your work, and especially the extensive footnotes that are there. Let's get right into it. Let's get right into the book itself.
Perhaps I can say something about
sure.
Book element. I mean, it is true that also myself, when I was teaching and sort of researching particular periods, there was no such text where you could sort of reliably say, okay, but what happened there a century before, or, well, what is the, origin of a particular issue or a particular polemic, or also of a more positive relationship, or what happened at the same time that you were working on a country in another country, So in a sense, yes, the idea was to make this accessible for students and for the wider public, but it is, as you say, probably usable for undergraduate and postgrads, perhaps not in the same way, but there's definitely a lot of leads for further inquiry in the notes and so on and so forth. So I'll definitely be using it in teaching, and I think it actually works relatively well, the different chapters sort of dealing with different periods. So, to be used in teaching.
Yeah, and I would, if I would add, even from a public policy standpoint, I think that, when I meet people who work outside of the academy, there's very little known about the subject. Their assumption is that Shias and Sunnis have always been fighting. They'll always be at some de facto state of war with each other, and that's just the way it is. But clearly, this book sheds a lot of light on essentially complicating that simple reductionism, right? Which I think is a great contribution, not only for the academy, but towards, hopefully even for people within public policy as well, or people who may not be within the academy but can benefit from knowing about these things. Let's discuss how, this is a general question, but we can get into specifics a little bit more about how earlier periods shaped later periods, right? I see the progression in your book, right? You start early, but then you see how later periods are heavily influenced by earlier periods. I find this fascinating. Very, very, very unique, a kind of unique, interesting approach that you took. Do you want to shed a little bit more light upon that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so in some ways, the book is sort of written against these simplistic narratives, as you mentioned, of 1,400 years of eternal conflict, and that from the beginning, there were these two main groups, and they were perpetually at war with each other. And I think, despite sort of the title, perhaps sometimes people now would think, okay, this is a study of binaries and maybe reinforcing that notion of binaries. But I think if you read the book, you see that I'm actually trying to problematize these binaries and show how first it took several centuries for Sunnism and Shi'ism to be formed in broadly the sense that we understand them later. So even sort of the core beliefs, it took quite a while. And there was a lot of cross-fertilization, and even, I guess, one probably wouldn't have been, come into existence without the other. So sort of delineating themselves slowly in theology and in law from each other was a drawn-out process, but one that, took several centuries. And also thereafter, it was never sort of a linear story. But at the same time, I did think that taking a chronological approach, I mean, when writing a book, it's often the easiest approach, because if you don't do it chronologically, you end up introducing things which you have to explain, and, it might be even more confusing. So, moving chronologically, broadly speaking, is usually the best. I mean, it's usually the way in which readers can most easily follow your story, even if it's something quite complicated. But at the same time, of course, I mean, earlier periods shape later periods. But what I also show is that in later periods, the early periods get invoked in certain ways. And I think that's another sort of theme of the book, the politics of history, of historiography, and of, invoking and making alive sort of the historical past. But of course, how the early madhabs spread, which empires ruled where, converted which populations to what, and so on and so forth. This sets the stage then for, where are actually Sunnis and Shi'is living next to each other? Because in those places, where you have hardly a Shi'i presence, in the sort of broadly speaking Islamic world, then, the issue, or Shi'ism is hardly a topic in those places. So I also must admit that certain areas are, don't really come up much in the book. So Al-Andalus, for example, or part of Southeast Asia in certain periods are outside of the realm of this book, which focuses largely on sort of, Egypt, North Africa to India, to the Indian subcontinent, in itself quite a large area, and parts of the Balkans and obviously the Ottoman Empire. But some areas are out of it. But yeah, I mean, the moving chronologically, I think was one way, basically of telling the story and making sense. But I'm not trying to argue that, again, it's a sort of linear story of just sort of, of two binaries sort of escalating. Having said that, it is a story, broadly speaking, of hardening sectarian identities. I mean, we cannot, disregard the fact that sort of in the early modern period, 1500, it's a big rupture. So therefore, it's part two of the book starts there. And then sort of the modern period and the last few decades, I mean, have seen a sort of a hardening of sectarian identities and a sort of move away from this more sort of confessionally ambiguous trend that perhaps we'll be talking about in a bit. So this is, I sense, where the chronological approach comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of, again, a kind of more broader, before we get into more details, a broader question that comes into my mind is the distinction between scholarly definitions of confessional identities and the laity, if I may use that word. And perhaps it's not even really possible entirely to access information regarding how people lived their everyday lives, whether it be in Baghdad or Cairo or in Ray or in Kufa or other places like that. But I guess that distinction between the way religion is presented, or the way an ideal Sunni identity is presented, the way an ideal Imami Shi'i identity is presented, or Ismaili or Zaydi, and the way people live their lives every day, right? Which I remember having a discussion with a friend of mine from Baghdad, from Kadhimiya, and he was just telling me how, we're raised with these, like we hear these Shi'i slogans, these Sunni slogans, but in reality, we have all kinds of intermarriage going on in our lives. And I don't know how far back that is going. He used to tell me that we were, we weren't really made aware of our sectarian identity, so to speak. I know we'll come to this in a bit, but until later on. But my point is that, could you maybe just opine a little bit upon the distinction between, or how this may relate to the distinction between the scholarly class and the laity?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is true for history writing in general in any region, that broadly speaking, we obviously know much more about what the elites thought, for most of pre-modern history and also, modern history, than what the non-elites thought, in a sense, or did. I mean, the main reason for that being that writing, was very limited, and yeah, frankly, we generally don't really know how much of the world sort of, or let's say most Muslims lived their lives and what they precisely believed or did. And there's an additional problem that there is a tendency sort of in the chronicles and in records to highlight sort of extraordinary events, and sometimes these are exactly those sort of sectarian events. So if like once a year or like every 10 years, let's say in Sunni ruled Syria, for example, in the medieval period, a Shi'i cleric gets into trouble, and then in a trial is a trial, and he's confirms his beliefs and gets killed. This happened a few times, and but it happened maybe once a decade, and then it didn't happen for 30 years again, and then didn't happen again. So if you, depending on, And sometimes in modern day sort of, communalist historiography, this has been presented, well, you see, there was this broad repression of let's say, Shi'ism in Ottoman or Seljuk Syria, for example. But if you, look at it in a different way, you ask yourselves, well, so how, why was it then that, large Shi'i communities survived for centuries, and these clerics even managed to sort of, teach each other, over centuries under Sunni rule, managed to travel around the whole area, and most of the time not get into trouble, in a sense. And that is never recorded, sort of the normality of everyday lives, but also of I guess, confessional interaction. A big thing is pilgrimage. I mean, you do have, of course, relatively often sort of recordings of, Shi'i pilgrims, getting into trouble, going to the Hijaz, for example. But on the other hand, most didn't get into trouble, and pilgrimage occurred for most, in a sense, of Islamic history, of all the different, trends. And so that is exactly, one of these points where one has to be really careful when trying to make generalized, broad claims based on a few cases that, that we know about. And it's one reason why the notes are so extensive, because frankly, a lot of these, things are quite sensitive. And, I want to sort of, be quite careful in making these broader, generalizations sometimes, and exactly sort of be nuanced in those sort of claims about earlier periods when frankly we don't really know how people lived, and I do think that for quite large sections of the population in quite a few places that the book talks about, allegiance to the family of the Prophet in general, sort of al-Bayt, as a sort of way of relating to the Prophet, and the many shrines that are associated with them or with other sort of locally important sort of religious figures, were an important part of everyday religiosity and of local pilgrimage, and people probably thought that's sort of mainstream, that's probably that's Islam, and weren't really giving that a name or differentiating it necessarily from something else, what we today understand, Sunnism and Shi'ism. And I think there's actually, some evidence, for example, from the, archaeology and so on, that we can say, and, that actually the shrines were used by many different people from different sort of religious backgrounds. And most of the time there was not a problem. So in a sense, I think this sort of popular religiosity is one way of getting at this sort of elite, non-elite, and sort of source problem in historiography.
Yeah, and that that brings us to I guess we'll move chronologically, but I wanted to discuss a little bit about Sufism as, again, being to a certain extent both yes and no, but that nexus between the laity and the popular, the laity, or so to speak, elite and non-elite, expressions of both confessional identity and confessional ambiguity, right? I mean, Sufism becomes a site for both of these, both in terms of Sunni and Shi'i. And you do talk about that in the book. You do mention that. What role did Sufism have? I know it's a very broad question, of course. The book discusses these things in depth, but for our short period together, why don't you shed a little bit of light on the role of Sufism in that regard as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, Sufism is crucial in a sense to the story of the book, and I mean to the story of Islam more broadly, but it's not easy to answer the question that you just posed me, because Sufism is a multifaceted, very wide phenomenon that over the centuries has had so many so many different tariqas and other phenomena have been subsumed under the rubric of Sufism, that it's actually also a very broad category. And so in a sense, people ask me, so how does it fit in here? And frankly, at the beginning, I thought, yeah, it's somewhere in the middle, and I'll be pretty brief in my account of Sufism. But then, of course, the longer I engaged, with the topic and interviewed people and traveled and so on and so forth and read, I realized actually it's really not that easy. And certain Sufi orders, as you will know from the book, played a very important role in sort of straddling the lines between Sunnism and Shi'ism, and also becoming sort of almost mainstream Islam in many contexts, in the 14th, 15th centuries, particularly in Central Asia and on the Indian subcontinent and so on and so forth. But others then, become very important actors in a sort of, confessionalization of the Islamic world and of Islam more broadly. Also around the same time. So yeah, perhaps like in the 13th, 14th century, we have a broadly speaking sort of, general Sufi movement where there isn't so much, confessional identity present. But afterwards, the most famous case are obviously the Safavids on the Shi'i side. There are many other Shi'i Sufi orders, but that, start to become a very, they eventually convert Iran to Shi'ism, and the Ismaili sort of movement lives for a very long time in a sort of Sufi order way, and on the other side, orders like the Naqshbandis are the most prominent example, I guess, I use in the book. Play a very important role in many of the sort of Sunni focused, also political and religious movements of the early modern and also modern period. And what is specific about the Naqshbandis and why they come up, quite a lot in the book, is that they are both important in the Ottoman Empire, but also on the Indian subcontinent. And there's actually sort of cross-fertilization at times. And they are really at the foundation of a sort of, Indian anti-Shi'ism in a sense, or an Indian Sunni identity that really doesn't get along with Shi'ism at all. So how do you square this, the general idea of Sufism as sort of, post-confessional or non-confessional sort of major Islam, but then also Sufi tariqas playing an incredibly important role in the whole story. Yeah. It's not easy, and that's one reason why the book is quite long. But I would just say that, like Sunnism and Shi'ism, Sufism is an incredibly diverse phenomenon that over the centuries has had so many iterations. But that its contributions have to be understood if we want to understand Sunni-Shi'i relations.
That's so interesting, right? How the engagement with some kind of esoteric spirituality can both blur the lines as it pertains to confessional identity, as well as reinforce it, right? It can serve both aims depending on the time period and the place and the group, of course. I mean, it's such a broad subject, as you said, right? And it's often also weaponized in different ways, right? Or politicized and weaponized as well, right? Spirituality or some kind of esoteric spirituality in order to assert a specific confessional agenda as well.
Yeah, and I guess we don't have to, one of the problems is obviously reading history backwards and seeing Sufism like today. Sometimes, Sufism is under attack or something like that. So you think but at certain moments in Islamic history, Sufism was the dominant sort of, religion, legitimizing, there was a religion of the state. And, but at the same time, it could, the most famous case is that Ibn Taymiyyah, was eventually, his main problems came from the Sufi orders, and, this eventually led to his execution. But at the same time, you have both Sunni and Shi'i rulers and mainstream clerics being very anti-Sufi. I mean, at certain moments in time. So again, the story is not. So I guess Sufism, like the other movements and terms, needs to be broken down, and I mean, perhaps isn't really such a useful term in this regard. I mean, the spiritual, the journey of the individual, that's obviously something different, and I guess that's how, in the end, so many scholars and people throughout history could say that I'm a Sufi, although them doing incredibly different things in their lives.
Yeah, and both, of course, the Shi'i and the Sunni dimension of that, right? As you mentioned, right? Through both the Ottomans and the Safavids used Sufism. I wanted to rewind a little bit. I don't know, really rewind, because Sufism is a thread that runs really throughout Islamic history from the early period, or from the early centuries until the modern period. But let's talk a little bit about the Fatimids. What a fascinating empire, and a fascinating and intriguing time in history, when a minority Shi'i sect rules over large swaths of the Muslim world, of the Arab-speaking Muslim world especially, North Africa, Egypt, part of Jerusalem. What role did they have? Just generally speaking, if you want to highlight a couple of things from that period with regards to Sunni-Shi'i relations.
Yeah, I mean, this, the period of Fatimid rule was in the past often called the Shi'i century. So, I mean, I try not to invoke this too much. The Shi'i century, Sunni Revival, it's been problematized a lot by scholars on these periods. But at the same time, it retains some usefulness for, a broader, audience, because in that period, it did actually look like, around, the 10th, 11th century, it did look almost as if Shi'ism could become, the mainstream form of Islam, or, was no longer the minority group. Having said that, it was actually Ismailism that sort of was the most powerful at that moment, and then come the Buyids. So you do have, I think one of the main interesting things now looking back is that actually 12 Shi'i, Ismailis, and Zaydis really don't get along in this period. Yes. Okay, there are nuances and so on, and the Fatimids also employ 12 Shia, and one of the interesting things is that they allow sort of, ruling, they allow sort of judiciary, also not just, so they allow not only Ismaili law, but also, the other, so especially Sunni schools of law. So they have a pretty ecumenical policy, actually, under their realm, which is interesting. But it also means that eventually they don't really convert Egypt or the territories they rule. So that is, I think, for me, is like, if we do a longer term study, so it's really different from the empires that come from around 1500 onwards, which really try to, convert, indoctrinate more or less the populations under their rule. And if they rule somewhere for 200 years, the population really changes. So the Fatimids, in that sense, they don't leave that legacy. They leave this legacy of institutionalization of Ismaili law, so the codification of Ismaili law, which then also influences sort of Shi'i law. But it is really also a period of Shi'i infighting, and even the Ismaili movement fights amongst itself, so the Karamita and so on and so forth. So it's hard again to make sort of too broad, in the Shi'i century, all the Shi'i were together, and then the Sunni Revival, all the Sunnis were together against the Shi'i. There are, elements of that, but a lot of it were sort of local dynasties, I guess, vying for power, and once they had, thought that their interpretation is the right one, they didn't really accept someone with slightly different views. the Fatimids obviously had this missionary movement associated with that, which spread Ismailism to India and other places, but and obviously ruled large parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, including Sicily, and so it was very interesting in that regard. But I think for my purposes, I'm relatively brief in my treatment of this period, because it does sort of differ, I think, in many ways from the sort of the Safavid, Ottoman, Uzbek, Mughal, Indian Shi'i dynasties that come to power around 1500, that really are a sort of early modern state that pays much closer attention to people's beliefs and so on.
Yeah, and I really like that point about the fact that the Zaydis, Ismailis, and the Twelvers didn't all necessarily get along during this time. There isn't one Shi'ism again, right? I mean, this whole the notion of this is it's anachronistic and incorrect.
And in the Sunni Revival, the different Sunni madhabs actually, were very strongly fighting mainly against each other, actually. It was very vicious, the madhab-based issues under the Seljuks.
Yes, exactly. And during the, as I recall, during the Buyids, when the Buyids were ruling as a client state of the Abbasids in Iraq, the 12 Shi'i scholars threw their support behind those rulers and not behind the Ismailis. In fact, they had I don't think they had very good relations or no relations with the Ismailis. Or I wouldn't say no relations, but certainly not positive. Because the Ismailis at the end of the day and the Fatimids were their direct competitors in some ways. So Sharif al-Murtada, Sheikh al-Mufid, these famous Shi'i clerics and scholars and jurists in Baghdad would have certainly saw themselves better off siding with the Abbasid client state in Iraq than it would be with the Ismailis. So again, yeah, I mean, we have to be careful in how we define Shi'ism as well. During this period, which brings us to the shaping of Muslim empires and the cementing of confessional identities, right? As you said, as you move forward in time, chronologically, we begin to see this cementing of confessional identities. Why don't we talk a little bit more about that, particularly, I guess, post-Seljuk, the post-Seljuk period. Would you agree that the Seljuk period heralded in what is often described as a Sunni revival, and particularly, would it be described as anti-Shi'i in some ways as a response to things? And then how that kind of affected, then we'll go from there, of course, on to the later period, but that kind of interlude period.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, yes. I mean, obviously, the Crusades are the sort of huge role in this, and I mean, this is mainly directed against the Crusaders, also that Sunni revival and the way it has been described, retrospectively, sort of. But I mean, I think then sort of the big shock are the Mongol invasions, and it was that interesting actually that the Mongols don't only kill the last Abbasid, and the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, but also make a point of abolishing Ismaili rule, and the last sort of main Ismaili bastion, and I was actually one of the two aims of the campaign. So the Ismailis were still seen as sort of a very dangerous and powerful movement by important rulers at the time, and that sort of double shock, I think, did open up sort of the space for Sufism and all sorts of Shi'i movements to emerge, more broadly, and leads then to this milieu in Anatolia that gives rise to both the Ottomans and the Safavids and to many other sort of such, Sufi orders with political ambitions. And that then, plays such an important role from 1500 onwards. I guess and there's now a lot of sort of revisionist scholarship, especially in Ottoman studies, about this period and the origin of the Ottomans, and also quite a lot about the early Safavid period. It's now much better studied, and there's much more nuance in a sense to for example, how the two originated, were actually quite close in the beginning and had strong relations, even actually after the Safavids took power in Iran. So it was only really when large parts of what the Ottomans considered their subjects, became sort of more or less soldiers for the Safavids, that that this whole this really broke down, and war broke out several times. And I think actually we can learn some lessons from that confrontation for sort of what went on in the past few decades. I mean, there's quite a lot about sort of territoriality and sectarian identity, crossing borders and sort of the idea of a fifth column in another state and so on, and that reinforcing sort of regional rivalries. But given what we've just talked about, one of its cases, things that's interesting about the Ottomans is their incorporation of Sufism into state ideology. So yes, on the one hand, they create a sort of state appointed Hanafi clergy and institute Hanafi Sunni law across the empire. But on the other hand, they sponsor different Sufi movements, and they don't really repress. I mean, Shi'ism. At the end, it's ultimately under Ottoman rule that the Shia of modern day Lebanon, survive or throughout Ottoman rule, and in Iraq, eventually, the conversion of what would later become Iraq. Most Iraqis were not Shia when the Ottomans sort of take over, start controlling that region in the 16th century. But most people are Shia when the Ottomans fall. So, most of the conversion is in the 19th century and partly in the 18th century. But, so they don't actually, repress Shi'ism wholeheartedly, although sometimes you hear this, in popular sort of memories. And one of the ways they sort of incorporate, the sort of pro-Shi'i Sufi tendencies, or that popular religiosity that we talked about before, is by sponsorship, or an alliance with the Bektashi Sufi orders. But also by sort of, taking, this idea that the al-Bayt play an important role, and so on and so forth. And, Ali is an important figure, and so on, that the Ottomans adopt that as part of their, raison d'etat. So they see themselves as a pan-Islamic, the ultimate pan-Islamic state on earth. And although the Ottomans never explicitly endorse Shi'ism or accept Shi'ism, 12 Shi'ism as an official madhab or anything like that, in practice, this sort of popular religiosity, which has strong Shi'i influences, is not only accepted but supported. So you see all the shrines under Ottoman control actually are allowed more or less to function, the al-Bayt shrines, and are actually supported often. And this for me is quite a remarkable feat, and sort of again nuancing the sort of broader story of just sort of very simple sort of Sunni-Shi'i conflict in a sense.
Or even the idea that Sunnis are anti-shrine to begin with, right? The whole modern conception is that these shrines in Karbala, Najaf, Kazimiya, particularly in Iraq, are for Shias, visited by Shias, Shia idol worship, or whatever it is described today, couldn't be further. I mean, it would seem from what you're saying, and historical fact, rather, that this is going to be further from the truth, per se, that these have been sites of joint visitation and again, would say maybe the blurring of confessional lines through these shrines, right? The people who are visiting them and partaking in rituals and the demonstration of devotion in these shrines during the Ottoman Empire. I think this is extremely important work because I work on ziyarat texts and devotional texts. So this is something that I'm personally very interested in kind of trying to debunk this idea that ziyarat or devotion or visiting these shrines is a Shia belief or a Shia act on its own. This may not be on the topic of the book exactly, but in your research, did you come across anything about relating to Karbala, Najaf, any of these shrines, and what the Ottomans had to say about it, or what Sunnis kind of had to said about it, or the way they may have described it?
I mean, yeah, there is quite considerable Ottoman texts about this, and also talking about pilgrimage and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't have it now from references, but some of it is in the book. I mean, it was certainly not forbidden. I mean, one of the things about the Ottomans ruled for so long that people sometimes, it's very hard to make generalizations. And as we get sort of into, the 19th century, it's a very different kind of state. So let's say the main period of tension is with the Safavids is really the 16th century. Then the 17th century, actually things are in general getting much better. And then the 18th century, when the Safavids fall down and so on, it's anyway not not really comparable. It's sort of in the 19th century when the Qajars also try to sort of build when the borders between the Ottoman Empire and Iran are delineated more strongly, that the state starts to resent this sort of continuing flow of money and people back and forth from Iran, or buying up property around the shrines. And the issue of residency permits, passports, which they become very important in the 20th century, but you see it already earlier. So there's a lot of sort of logic of the state that I don't think has specifically to do with sectarian tension or anything like that, but it's just trying to regulate borders and as these harden, by the 19th century, we also have the issue that the Ottomans lose, many of their Balkan possessions and other territories, Greece and so on. So their state becomes much more Muslim and less sort of multi-religious, multi-confessional, and thereby becomes also more Sunni in some ways. And there is a sort of very quite complex processes, which I look at in part 3 of the book, which I don't think we have now time to really talk about in depth, that make relations with Iran harder again, and that reflect on where the shrines are sort of one of the objects of tension at times.
And I remember you mentioning something about the book about the Dhulfiqār, the sword of Ali, right, being appropriated by the Ottomans, which today again is a prototypical Shi'i symbol, right? Shi'i, some Shi'is would wear it around their neck as a pendant. You can find it in the markets in Iran and Iraq. Generally, it's not conceived of as something that Sunnis would wear or would put on their, or use as paraphernalia. But apparently the Ottomans used these kinds of things as a part of their paraphernalia, almost as a way of pushing back against Shi'ism in some way, that by appropriating al-Bayt, they're in a way developing their own version of Ahlul Bayt, or their own way of presenting Ahlul Bayt minus Shi'ism in some way.
In some way, yes. I mean, the Zulfiqar was on the flag of the Janissaries, of the main sort of military force of the Ottoman Empire for most of its existence. So it was definitely part of the Ottoman state propaganda. And there's now quite a lot of work on this and other symbols. And I think there's more also to be done on this and you know, yeah, sort of these al-Bayt symbols in broad, what we consider broadly speaking Sunni contexts. I mean, the Janissaries were obviously very strongly associated with the Bektashi order, so there was a certain sort of Shi'i element to it. But as you say, you know, the Ottomans tried to incorporate what they could into their state, sort of, you know, legitimizing their state project. And I think that is very interesting from, you know, again, from today's perspective. Having said that, of course, eventually the Ottoman-Safavid rivalry, you know, hardened sectarian identities, especially, you know, the Safavids convert, I mean, Iran from, you know, majority Sunnism, I guess, to majority Shi'ism. And it's really quite, I mean, there we have more detailed reports about really what went on and so on. And that sort of conversion of of Iran in many ways lies also geographically sort of at the center of the Islamic world, you know, between different regions. And that has strong repercussions in, you know, Central Asia and on the Indian subcontinent. You have then these, you know, couple of local Shi'i rulers in India say, well, we want to do the same. And you know, we do like the Safavids and so on in the Deccan. And so, you know, you do have sort of, I think, sort of a Muslim age of confessionalization where state identity becomes more strongly associated with a specific form of Islam. It can be quite syncretistic, like in the Ottoman case, or the Mughal case is also, you know, Sufism plays a big role, and it is fairly syncretistic in some ways. But in the Mughal case, the Naqshbandis are, I mean, in a sense, the, you know, at the heart of the whole story. But for most of its period, it's sort of, you know, there is not a strong anti-Shi'ism, you know, being sponsored by the state or something like that. But in general, the rulers of this period, they start to adopt a more, you know, a stronger sectarian identity, and try also to convince their subjects that, you know, this is the right interpretation of Islam.
So the Safavids, and there's just so much to discuss in this book. We just won't have time for it. I think we have about, you know, still have a little bit of time left, but I really want to get to the modern state. We have to talk about
hurry up. I think we're doing, yes.
Yeah, we're doing good on time. The Safavids, again, Iran was not always Shi'i, as you said, right? I mean, today it's just seen as it's ubiquitous that Iran is Shi'i. Well, no, I mean, this just wasn't the case. And the same goes for Iraq as well, which is another fascinating historical, you know, fact, right? That both Iran and Iraq today are seen as symbols of Shi'ism, symbols particularly of Twelver Shi'ism, of Twelver Shi'i power, but neither were Twelver Shi'i for a large portion of their existence, right? It's only the last, well, the Safavids maybe 300, 400 years, Iraq maybe 200 years. Tell us a little bit about the Safavids in this case. Now, because we've talked a lot about how Sunnis kind of negotiated with Shi'ism. How did these Shi'i Messianic rulers that rose up in Iran, I know it's a very broad question, but deal with this predominant Sunni population that they're ruling over?
I mean, again, there's a little bit of revisionist scholarship saying that, well, you know, there were obviously some prominent Sunni families, especially on the, let's say, the periphery of the Safavid realm that you know, could become ministers even, you know, 200 years after the Safavids came to power and so on and so forth. But broadly speaking, they were pretty brutal in their conversion. And you know, they appointed famously Friday prayer leaders across the whole country and enforcers in the streets and so on to really, you know, top down sort of conversion to Twelver Shi'ism. And at the beginning, they had sort of that messianic element, you know, that brought them to power in many ways, that broadly speaking, after a while gave way to a sort of more legalistic, juridical sort of Shi'i clerical endorsement, that became sort of state ideology, and that shaped, I guess, Shi'ism, until today. So it was sort of the first time Shi'ism was used in that, in a large country for a long time as state ideology. And as I mentioned, it also had repercussions in India, where later on some Indian Shi'i rulers also converted to Shi'ism and tried to do the same. So yes, you mentioned that sort of the modern period. I think we should probably talk a bit about sort of
let's shift there.
We talked about the like in the mid 18th century, you have the Wahhabi movement emerging on the Arabian Peninsula, and that's sort of the first time, at least in that context, that very much sort of anti-shrine and anti-visitation becomes sort of the Wahhabis famously go into Iraq and ransack Karbala and so on. And there is a sort of reinforcing nature of Sunni and Shi'i revivalisms around that time. So I guess you have two stories that they're connected, of course. So on the one hand, you have developments somewhat internal to Islam. So, which I call revivalist movements that also start to be, there is a pan-Islamic element to them, but they also start to be against the other side quite strongly. So like the Wahhabis, but at the same time, you have that sort of much stronger European penetration and the beginnings of European colonialism. And so the, institutionalization of the modern state in its colonial form in Muslim majority societies that transforms the meaning of religion, what the category of religion entails, how it relates to the state, to law, and so on and so forth. So these two broad developments, they really reshape things, I think, dramatically, and so that's what I think part 3 of the book is about.
Which brings me to the fascinating, again, I use the word fascinating, I'll say interesting, intriguing, beneficial section about the British Raj. I had known this before, but again, reading your work really just, I think people just need to read this. I'm going to read a quote. From, again, coming to part 3, right? And we're dealing with colonialism now and colonial rule in India, British colonial rule in India. On page 201, there's a note from an 1891 census. I assume that census was commissioned by the British, right?
Yes.
Yeah, in India, right? And the census, and you're in quoting from your work on page 201. A note from the 1891 census is revealing, for the less instructed of Mohammedans, and especially among Sunnis, the difference between the two sects is little understood. And the enumerator had in general to ascertain the sect by a question as to how the hands were placed in prayer. Sunnis pray with one hand placed over the other in front of the body. Shias with both hands depressed by the sides. Asking this question sharpened sectarian boundaries. The 1901 census put it as follows. Taken as a whole, the Shias are probably better educated than the Sunnis because the latter sect is the more numerous, and difference from it involves some knowledge of principles beyond those held by the masses. End quote. This passage from the book is, I found, at least personally, is very telling. The interaction between colonialism, state rule, and the sharpening of confessional or sectarian identity, particularly in India, in British-ruled India. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, if anything, briefly? But I just found it very interesting and just very important, especially how of everything that has gone on and is going on right now in the subcontinent, especially in terms of sectarianism and sectarian violence and things like that. And this is not that long ago.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that for me was surprising, because broadly, I mean, I had mainly worked on the Middle East. So, the things on South Asia, I wasn't so aware of the vastness of the literature and the richness of the sources. And, they're fairly easily accessible. The British rule is very well documented, and it's actually many such quotes that you can find on loads of different aspects of sort of the regulation of religion and imposition of boundaries. So that took me quite a while to sort of, to get my head around. And I think one of the contributions of the book is that sort of comparative aspects of, the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia, and look at, how also these different regions influenced each other. And when we come to the colonial period, there's a very clear sense in which things in one region shape developments in another, and India by and large is of the case, the most important British colony eventually, and where many of the ways of regulating Islam become tested and solidified, and they later become applied in other parts of the British Empire, where Sunnis and Shia live side by side. Especially in the Gulf, for example, or in Iraq eventually. So, as you mentioned, censuses are one way. Clearly, one of the things I'm interested in is like how the category of Sunni and Shia become, dominant, and why, do like administrators, for example, think it's important to put this in a census. So there's clearly a backstory, and here also, Orientalism as a discipline, which starts to emerge, starts to play an important role. And it's here that, the early Orientalists, get trained in Cambridge or Oxford, and then in Oriental languages, often Persian. I mean, Persian was still the language of government in the Mughal Empire, and the East India Company initially also, used Persian for wide, many of these areas. So, and they started, reading the texts about, Islam, Islamic law, especially. An early interest was in commercial law, and then in law, personal status law. So, inheritance, as the East India Company and then British state, they wanted to have a seemingly rule of law, right? Sort of, in the actual territories, or at least a semblance. It enabled the broader sort of, stealing of the wealth of the whole country by having a sort of notion that on a local level, there is that sort of sense of the rule of law. So, they codified Islamic law according to in new ways in which it hadn't been codified before. So before, there are two famous attempts we've actually mentioned the Ismaili codification of law before under the Fatimids. And then under the Ottomans and under the Mughals, there was also, sort of fatwa collection. But the British Orientalists that work sort of for the East India Company, they translate this all into English, and they do actual law, books for administration by also British judges and so on and so forth. And in these, from very early on, you have Sunni and Shi'i as two separate legal categories. And it's actually the first time, perhaps ever, we talk quickly about the Fatimids, but in general, all of these states that we talked about, you could not really, you couldn't say, if the ruler, under the Ottomans, it was just Hanafi law was the law for Muslims. There was no, you couldn't say I want to have my estate divided according to a Shi'i law or something like that. So under the English, for the first time, this was done, and it was, systematized and institutionalized in the legal system. So it became known as Anglo-Mohammedan law quite early on, actually, in the 19th century. And this reinforced dramatically the notion of what you are, because people were no longer Muslim. They were either Sunni or Shi'i. And then a third legal category emerges, Ismaili or Khoja. That's actually also interesting. So you can have you can choose three different legal identities, and you need to always mention them, like when you get married, or you know, when someone dies, and on other occasions. So frequently in someone's lives, they will have to tick a box. And that is new, and that's sort of the classic. There's tremendous amount, you know, of scholarship about the importance of the modern state in shaping collective identities in general. And here we really have the case of the state, you know, sectarianizing Muslim societies in ways that they weren't really, you know, there before. I mean, some of the Shi'i elites, you know, scholars and you know, rulers and senior sort of businessmen, they obviously thought of themselves as Shi'i and sort of wrote about this. But much of the population, let's say Muharram rituals had just become part of everyday religiosity. They were quite prominent in many cities in India, but they were not often or not always, I mean, they were clearly not only attended by Shia, for example. So it was broadly, and they were also attended by non-Muslims and are until today, actually, in many cases. So there was a sort of broad popular religiosity that also, you know, didn't fit neatly into those lines. And the British administrators also regulated this. So, for example, there are some other good quotes in the book about, you know, when the British in Lucknow say that, well, actually, you know, it doesn't make sense if Sunnis and Shia join the same Muharram route, because for them this is about, you know, completely opposite things. So they should have two separate processions. So they actually decide that, no, Sunnis should have their own procession and Shia have their own procession, which start in different parts of the city. And that then leads to clashes. You know, once that is sort of done that way, then they actually clash. But, you know, so there's a very clear sense in which sort of the modern state, you know, perhaps even created some of these, or definitely changed the meaning of these identities.
Or at least instrumentalizes, as you've said at the beginning of your book and throughout, right? It becomes instrumentalized either, for whatever reason that they did these things. Could be divide and conquer, or just for them, just for the simple bureaucratic decision to segment the society. But it's extremely important. This book is important just for so many different reasons. If not one very simple reason, is to break down those common misnomers and misapprehensions about Sunni and Shi'i relations. And I really appreciate, and I think other people will certainly appreciate your scholarship on this topic. I think we'll wrap it up there.
Thank you very much.
It was a really, really wonderful discussion having you on here today. To all the viewers, you can find us on www.shiaresearch.ca. You can follow the Inside Interview series on Spotify, YouTube, and other platforms. If you'd like to support us, you can support us through our website, shiaresearch.ca. And we look forward to having you on our next interview. Thank you once again, Dr. Matthiesen, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me and for the great conversation.